My name is Kyle Royer.
Oh, it's hot. It's really hot.
And I'm making my second ever sword named Excelsior.
It's even more steel than I used on my first sword.
So let's embark together on this epic edged adventure. In this video, we're making Excelsior Scabbard. It's gonna be a wood sheath with a velvet lining on the inside and a really nice leather covering on the outside. Let's jump right into it and get to work. If you've been following along with Excelsior's build so far, then you'll know that we've got the sword blade ready to go. The fittings are all shaped and they all go together with line-up pins, and the pommel nut holds everything together. The pommel's shaped, handle, front spacer, guard, pommel nut, it's all shaped, ready to go. I want to stop right now and build the scabbard for Excelsior so we don't have to worry about scratching the finished sword. I went ahead and purchased a poplar 1x8. So the main frame or the body of this sheath is going to be made out of this poplar board. And I traced around the sword, and then I left about a ½ inch, a little bit less than a ½ inch on each side of the sword of extra material. That way we'll have plenty of room for the sword in there. We're going to have a nice velvet lining on the inside, and the outside is going to be covered with leather. So I went ahead and cut out these two pieces, and the next thing we need to do is run them through the planer and get them thinned down. Right now they're about 3/4 of an inch thick. Probably gonna take it down to about half that thickness, kind of depending. I'm gonna check on it a lot as we go, make sure I get the right thickness. And once that's done, we can move on to possibly hollowing out the inside of the scabbard for the sword blade itself. I've got the two sides of the scabbard planed down to about 300 thousandths of an inch thick, and I went ahead and traced out the shape of the blade onto each half. I had to make this section right here in the middle a little wider though, because this is a leaf-shaped blade, and this section out here is wider than this section of the blade. So in order to get the blade in and out of the scabbard, I have to make this section at least as wide as the widest part of the tip area in order to even get it in and out. Otherwise it's just gonna get stuck right here when we go to put it in. The next thing we need to do is hollow out the inside of the sheath. The blade is about 1/4 of an inch thick, so we need to hollow out half of that thickness on each half, plus the thickness that we need for the velvet. I have two different sizes here. I have a really thick and a really thin velvet. The red one has a sticky adhesive on the back and it's thin, and then this black one we'll have to contact cement it on. I think I'm gonna go with the black one because it has a higher pile, and I think it'll give us a smoother fit on our blade into the scabbard, and I think it'll also give a little bit more room for, like, if you have a piece of grit or a burr or something on your blade when you put it in the scabbard, instead of it being like scraping up against the blade and scratching it really badly, I think this higher, thicker velvet should give a place for debris and stuff. It should give it a better place to go, like down at the bottom of it. Kind of picture it like a higher shag carpet, where it can collect more dirt and stuff down at the bottom so you don't see it at the surface. That would be bad in your house, but that's gonna be good in this scenario because I don't want that dirt and debris that may ever get on the blade to be scraping against the blade every time it goes in and out of the scabbard, just scratching it all up. So let's head over to the grinder. I'm gonna use the 2-inch round wheel and probably just start with a 36 grit belt and just get the bulk of the material removed out of the middle. And then after that, we can go to scrapers or the angle grinder and or chisels or all the above. We'll see what it takes to get this all hollowed out. Scabbard's coming along really nicely. I got the inside completely hollowed out, and I not only left enough room for the blade to fit, but also for 2 layers of velvet. We're gonna be putting 1 layer of velvet on each half of the scabbard, and we needed to make the whole inside large enough to accommodate that. This velvet is gonna be amazing, by the way. I cut a couple little pieces, just rough cut these. These aren't gonna be the final ones we put in there. We're gonna try to cut those more accurately. But I wanted to rough cut them so I could get the proper hole hollowed out inside of the scabbard for the blade to fit in there with both layers of velvet and for it to all just slide right in. And let me tell you, this stuff is amazing compared to what I did on my last scabbard. It had a leather lining on it, and that leather was way more like sticky or something. It grabbed hold of the blade a lot more. This just slides in and out so nicely. And since the velvet kind of sticks up more and it has like a higher pile to it, there's a little more wiggle room for error as far as getting a good fit in there. After getting the inside just the right size for both layers of velvet and the sword blade, I have moved on to putting some lineup pins in the scabbard itself. I also didn't do this on the last one, but I wanted to be able to pop both halves together and take it apart and have it go back to the exact same spot every time, just like I do on my takedown handles. So I went ahead and stuck some lineup pins in there. We've got 2 up here, 2 in the middle, 1 on the end. Probably way overkill, but it's really nice. And these clips, I'm just using these office clips or office clamps. I don't know if you call them a clamp in the office, but I'm using these just to clamp it together as I work on it and everything. And they're like the perfect size to securely hold it. And I've got a whole bunch of them here. I also shaped the end of the scabbard so the guard fits beautifully right to the end of the scabbard, so we get a really nice fit between the guard and the scabbard itself. The scabbard's looking really good. We have a lot to do still, but it's getting exciting because we're pretty close to that stage, believe it or not, to where we can actually put our velvet on the inside permanently and get our leather on the outside permanently as well. Next thing we need to do is take this over to the grinder and start doming the edges. It'll make it look thinner, it'll make it so we can wrap our leather around the edges, and we'll probably have a seam right down the middle of the edge where the leather meets, just like the two pieces of wood meet right here, and we'll stitch that seam up all the way around the scabbard itself. It's time for earplugs, ventilation, coarse belts on the grinder, safety glasses, and a coffee break for good measure. Oh yeah, that's good, that's good. I've got the velvet lining glued into both halves of our scabbard. I'm gonna pop this thing together and put all these little office clamps on there, and we'll see if the sword still fits really well or not. From this point on, I also wanna make sure the blade is very clean and free from debris every time we put it in the scabbard, because we don't wanna get any kind of metal filings or sand or dust or dirt or anything in there, because that could scratch the future blade. That felt really good. That felt really good. It's a tiny bit loose still. Like, if it doesn't tighten up at all, I would still be happy with it this loose. But I'm expecting it's gonna tighten up quite a bit once we put leather around these two halves and stitch it all up. We're gonna have really tight stitching all around the seam. The last time I did a scabbard, it actually tightened it up a bunch, and it tightened it up too much, and I had to kind of stretch the inside of the scabbard out. That is really starting to take shape there. This thing is thin too. I'm super happy with how thin I was able to get it. We've got a beautiful fit up here. The corners are all rounded and everything. I think it's time to move on to putting the leather on the outside of this thing.
Day 3.
Update on what's going on with the scabbard. It has been 3 work days since I last showed you what's going on. I've had so many different trial and error experiment things happen. Let's run through it. The first thing I spent like a day working on is the end of the scabbard, getting some way to cover the very end of the wood and make it look nice up there. I went through multiple different pieces of leather, trying different cowhide out, trying super glue and trying contact cement and all sorts of different ways to get it to stick on there. There's not a lot of surface area, so I needed something that would stick really well. And I used contact cement after many trial and error things, and I carefully cut it around so it's the exact same size as the scabbard and cut out the inside so the sword fits in and out nice and cleanly. I spent an entire day practicing on stitching up the shark skin. So I grabbed a bunch of different markers, I grabbed a hammer, I put some shark skin around it just to kind of pretend that it was a mock-up of the scabbard, and then I practiced doing different types of stitching at that butted up seam. So we're gonna have a butted up seam all the way around the edges of the scabbard. So there's gonna be a lot of stitching and I want it to look as good as I can get it. So one of the problems I was running into is that butted up seam. I could get it looking really nice when I glued it all together, but then when I would stitch it, it would pull up and leave this really high ridge right where the stitch was, and I did not like that. I got on the internet, looked up stuff on how to harden leather up and everything, and one of the things I actually ran across was a lot of people saying to use this tan coat, which I already had. It's a leather finish. We're gonna soak down the area that's gonna have that butt seam, where the two pieces of leather meet and there's a stitch, and we're gonna soak it down really heavily on the back side of the leather, the really loose fibrous side that'll soak up a lot of stuff, and that should harden the leather up in that area just a little bit and make it less squishy and less stretchy and enable me to be able to sew that together without it puckering up so much and leaving this really tall seam. I think we're finally ready to move on to actually working on the scabbard once again. What I've done to start working with our shark skin is I took apart the scabbard and I laid it down on the shark skin and I've drawn around it with a Sharpie. And then I've already cut out one piece. I cut out about 3/4 of an inch away from my line because I need enough material to wrap around those edges. And that line is gonna be a good reference for where I need to put this tan coat. We're gonna soak down the edges. I'm not gonna put it everywhere because we don't need the whole thing stiff. In fact, it'll be really nice if we leave the majority of it kind of flexible. It'll bend around the curves better. But we need the edge really stiff so it'll stitch together better. I've got one piece cut, one piece to go. We'll cut out this piece and then I'll start applying that tan coat to the edges. And then I think we're gonna use a hairdryer to help it dry quicker. After all that, I think we'll be moving right along to using the contact cement and contact cementing this stuff to the scabbard pieces. Both halves of the scabbard are ready to go together. The last thing I did in preparation was to mark out a line right next to the edge where our stitching goes, and then I took a stitch marker and ran it all the way around so we can get a nice even spacing on our stitches. That left nice little indents so I can see where each stitch goes. To make the holes in the leather itself, we're gonna use an awl instead of drilling the holes in like what I normally do with my thick leather sheaths. We'll take the awl and press it through the leather, and that'll leave a nice little kind of squished out hole instead of a drilled out hole. There's one more thing I want to do before I put the two halves together though, and that is to do a little test on some of the same poplar that the Scabbard is made out of. I also put some black Sharpie on here in the area that I'm gonna glue together, and that's just to represent what we've got going on the Scabbard itself, because the Scabbard itself, I have some black Sharpie on here, and I just did that to kind of darken everything in case we could see through any of the stitching or anything anywhere. I didn't want to see any bright colored wood and through one of the holes of the stitching or something like that later on. So we need to make sure it's going to stick really well. So I'm going to use some Starbond super glue on these test pieces. We're going to put some on there, get it dried, and then make sure that it's holding really well before I do the same thing on the Scabbard. I'm going to use thick Starbond super glue to hopefully super glue the Scabbard together. So that's what we're going to do on the test piece here. I like the thick stuff because you can put it on and it doesn't run all over, and you get a little more time to work with it before it dries out. And especially on wood, sometimes really thin super glue can just soak into the wood and like have some kind of weird chemical reaction and set up before you even get your pieces together. But this thick should give us more time, make less mess, and actually allow us to glue pieces together before it sets up. I'm gonna put the target amount that I would probably put on the Scabbard, do about the same amount on this as what I'm planning on doing with that. Maybe just take this Q-tip and spread it around a little bit. I think I'm just gonna put it on 1/2. Nice light coating. We'll pop the other half on there. And we'll let that dry for a few minutes. I could use Accelerator, but that would probably only reach the outside surface, and I want it to dry all the way through before we start trying to pull this thing apart. So I'm just gonna let it dry naturally. Didn't use a lot, so it should only take a couple minutes, and we'll see how well this held. I'm expecting the super glue to hold super strong and actually kind of tear apart at the wood, like leave some wood stuck to the other piece is kind of what I'm hoping to see. And in that case, we'll be good to go and do the exact same thing on the Scabbard itself. It's been about 10 minutes. I think it's probably fully dried inside of there, at least well enough for our test. You can get it to dry a lot quicker if you use accelerant or something, or if you're using a thinner one, but since we're super gluing wood to wood, I just wanted to let it dry on its own and give it a little bit of time. So first of all, we'll just pry on it by hand a little bit. And it's definitely not gonna do anything by hand at all, so let's put it in the big vise hooked up to the 450-pound anvil, welded to the anvil, and I'll pry on it by hand a little bit.
How heavy is the anvil?
450 pounds. Wow. That held really well. I'm content with that for our Scabbard. In some of the places, it actually pulled the Sharpie mark and a little bit of the wood off of the other piece on the other side. And kind of ripped a little bit of the surface layer of wood off. That'll work extremely well. It probably sticks even better to the bare wood, but just like the Scabbard is covered in Sharpie because I didn't want any kind of light wood to be showing on the inside, for that reason, I went ahead and put Sharpie on our test piece as well, because I thought the Sharpie might inhibit the amount of hold that it would have, but that seemed to be really, really good. I about pulled it was starting to pull the anvil over. I almost had to get the wrench out. I'm really liking Starbond's products so far. They have a lot of different thicknesses, which is really handy because you can come up with a bunch of different uses for different thicknesses. Sometimes you want the really, really runny stuff. Sometimes you want a medium. Sometimes you want a thick. And I really like that. I also really love the accelerator in an aerosol can is really, really handy. So if you guys are looking for some good super glue, I highly recommend Starbond. If you use the coupon code in the description below, you'll get 15% off, and we'll also be making a little cut from that purchase, so that helps us out a lot too. And I found that their super glue is very competitively priced with other super glues that I've used in the past. But with that coupon, it makes it actually cheaper. The test was successful, so we can move on to super gluing the scabbard halves together. I've also got 5 little tiny lineup pins here. So if you remember earlier on, I put 5 lineup pin holes in the scabbard so it would go back to the exact same spot every time when we put it together. So I've got some really short ones. We'll stick those in there and probably cover it in super glue and then stick the pins in. Or I might stick the pins in and then cover it in super glue, and then we'll get both of these halves together. Update on the scabbard. Right when I was getting it super glued together, I noticed one of the lineup pins was pushing the leather out a little bit. I super glued those lineup pins in, but I think I didn't get one of them very well. It had almost no super glue on it, and it maybe didn't dry yet, but I ended up taking my razor knife and popping both pieces apart. The super glue wasn't set up yet, thankfully. Got both pieces apart, scraped all the super glue off with my razor knife, and then in this part that doesn't have the pins in it currently, I made all the holes a little bit larger with a tiny bit larger drill bit, just so they'll get started better. And in the other part, with the lineup pins in it already, I super glued those in super securely. And before, I guess I was not very secure with that one pin and it kind of pushed through. So something else I'm gonna do differently this time as well is, instead of flattening the super glue, I'm just gonna leave a bead of it sticking up. And that way I think it'll make better contact as well. Because I noticed flattening it out, it didn't make contact everywhere because these parts aren't completely flat. They're pretty flat, but they're not like perfectly flat after all the scraping and gluing of leather and different things I've done to this thing. Here we go for attempt number 2. It's been a few minutes. It's all looking really good. I don't see pins sticking through anywhere on the leather, so I think we're good there. I think we've got a good solid hold. Go ahead and pop off all the clamps. Make sure this thing doesn't like spring apart. It's not going to. Oh man, this thing is looking really cool. You know, I actually have a love-hate relationship with this thing. I love how it's coming out, but I also hate it at the same time because working with leather and stuff, it's just not my thing. It is a struggle to work with the leather like this and marry leather, wood, and metal together is just not really my thing. So I love it and I don't love it at the same time. It is looking good. We are ready to move on to stitching. This thing is primed and ready to go. I've got all the stitch marks ready to go. We've got the other line on there where it needs to go. I'm probably gonna use an awl as I go for the holes, and I'll do that as I go, maybe 5 or 10 or 15 holes at a time. And yeah, I need to get my string ready to go and start stitching.
A few moments later.
I've stitched about 1/4 of the way around the scabbard so far, and I wanted to stop and show you guys what my method has been so far for stitching this. So what we've got here is we've got a faint line that you probably can't see because I can barely see it myself. I've got a faint line on each side of the seam. And then on one side of the scabbard only, I used my stitch marker wheel to mark out the stitches. So there's little tiny divots on one side only. I only want them on one side because it'd be really hard to get them lined up on both sides properly. But if I have them on one side, what I can do is take this awl and I can just line it up with the stitch mark across the way and then use my line I have on here. And then I start really steep, I poke it in a little bit, and then I flatten it out. Go to the next hole, the next little mark there, steep, flat, got stuck on the wood, make a little hole. Go to the next one. Now I'm doing 20 or 30 holes normally, and then I'll stitch it, and then I'll do the next 20 or 30. So there's 3 of them. I'll just demonstrate 4 for now. Now I flip the scabbard around, and then we come in here and we do the holes on the other side. This time I've got the marks right there next to me. I'm not gonna do it right on the marks though, because like I said earlier, I'm actually going slightly wider than what I'd planned on. So my line goes right through here. I'm gonna just go on the far side of the line. Start steep, flatten it out a little bit. I'm just going until I see my tip in the middle, just barely kind of go through the middle. Go to the next hole. Steep, if it gets caught on the wood, then you pull back a little bit. There we go. That should be ready to stitch. So for the stitching, I'm doing this X pattern. So we need to take this thread and it needs to go across on a 45-degree angle. So we're gonna take it across and go to that hole on the far side. And then it's a bit tricky to get it to line up with the other hole sometimes. Sometimes I gotta take the needle and kind of poke it in from both directions in order to get it to go through. We're gonna pull that through. And then again with this one, we want it to go across the other way. So we're just gonna bring it across and go onto that hole. Normally the second needle is a lot easier to get through since there's already a good hole started. And now, a little bit of a tricky part, we wanna pull it tight so it pulls that seam closed, but we don't wanna pull it so hard to where that thread starts cutting through the leather. Because this shark skin is pretty soft stuff, even though we've hardened it up a little bit, still pretty soft. Just a little. So far, I've only had one place where the thread started to cut into the leather a little bit further than what was acceptable. And in that case, I loosened the thread and then I put a little bit of super glue to kind of hold the leather from tearing further, and then I tightened it back up gently. So I'm very happy about that, but I'm trying to make sure that doesn't happen as much as possible. So we'll do one more here. Get it in there, work it through. If it starts pushing out on the leather too much, you might have to come in from this direction and kind of work that hole in the other way. Some of them are really fussy and some of them go super smooth. I'm getting a good system down though where I don't have to spend near as long as I was in the beginning. And then pull it tight. And then we repeat that like a million times until we're all the way around to the other side. Once that's done, all I have to do is come up with a way to do some nice stitching around the end of the scabbard, and we'll be ready for finish coats after that. I finished stitching up the entire scabbard, and I went over every little hole with my little piece of deer antler and kind of burnished down some of the holes that were sticking up. Some of them had this little flap of leather that kind of got pushed out from the awl that I used to poke the holes. So I laid all those little pieces of leather down, and I lightly went over the entire scabbard with some black leather dye. And the main reason for that was because all those little holes, some of them you could see a little bit of the lighter colored leather that's kind of in the middle of the leather piece, because this particular leather isn't dyed all the way through. So you could see some little light spots here and there, some brown. So I lightly sprayed the entire thing down with some leather dye, and we're ready to do the final finishing of the leather itself. We're gonna do 2 coats of Wyo Sheen leather finish. I'll show you guys the first coat, and the second coat will be exactly the same. And I'll probably let it dry at least a good number of hours in between coats. I might even let it dry overnight, and then this thing will be finished. The sword still fits in it, so we're good to go. Let's get this thing finished, and then we can move on to doing all the embellishments on the sword. Next video, we're gonna be going back to the sword and we're gonna do embellishments. We've got to flute the handle, do tons of gold wire inlay, hand sanding, bluing, etching, lots of exciting stuff to come. So until then, I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye! Oh, did you hear my arm pop?